What's good, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to MKO Boxing, aka MKO Pugilism, where we talk all things boxing. Remember to like and subscribe on YouTube, follow on TikTok, all that good stuff. So, yeah, it's the day after the night before. Last evening, of course, we had Chris Eubank Jr. versus Conor Benn, the rematch. And yeah, it wasn't anywhere near as eventful as the first fight, nowhere near sort of as action packed, but it was one of those things where the rematch made financial sense. But I was thinking, just as it was in the first fight, so it was in this second fight, where you have Chris Eubank Jr., who's been like a career middleweight. He's been at super middleweight before. And I thought this was one of those fights where really it's one of those kind of one and done things where you don't need necessarily to do it again, especially since Eubank Jr. won the first fight. But obviously they offered a big bag. The clause was still there for the same day weigh-in and stuff like that. So yeah, anyway, the fight went ahead, and it was the ring walks were epic. Conor Benn with the drums and all this crazy stuff, and Chris Eubank Jr. smashed it as well, brought out 50 Cent and all that. And I think for Chris Eubank Jr., the best part was the ring walk, the kind of whole surprise element of having 50 Cent walking him out, many men, and all these hits of his likes and all that. So that was probably the best part for Eubank Jr. because he came in that ring, and to be real with you, he was just a shell of himself. He looked skinny, he looked completely drawn, and from that opening bell, I thought he'd done okay in the first round. Maybe you could shade the first round to him, but you could tell like he just wasn't pulling a trigger, and you could just tell, like, even from that opening round, that listen, the guy was gone. He was just a shell of himself, all completely skin and bones. I mean, Conor Benn is meant to be the welterweight coming up, should I say? And Conor Benn looked much healthier. He looked kind of bigger. He looked stronger. Eubank Jr. looked very drawn, very slim. And throughout this fight, it was the same old story over and over again, where you would have Conor Benn sort of on the outside looking to counter Chris Eubank. Just Conor Benn was very conservative. He didn't really do all that much, but he was just doing enough to sort of beat Chris Eubank Jr. from the outside. And I thought Conor Benn with the low left hand was wide open for a right hand from Chris Eubank Jr. And I was thinking, why isn't Eubank throwing that shot? And it just didn't happen. So yeah, it was overall a good performance by Conor Benn. But it's one of those performances where you have to congratulate him. He beat what was in front of him, but because of how diminished Chris Eubank Jr. was, it's kind of hard to even gauge that performance off of Conor Benn, because he had a man in front of him who just couldn't pull the trigger. And for me, I think it was, down to Eubank's body, not really being able to do that weight anymore. He just seemed completely and utterly drained. And I think you're talking about, it's kind of more down to that than just Conor Benn just being sort of better in some way, because you could see Eubank Jr. couldn't really throw punches. It was just minimal work rate. He was on the retreat. He just wasn't able to let his hands go hardly ever. And the interesting thing was I was kind of expecting, given how diminished Chris Eubank Jr. was and how diminished he looked, I was kind of expecting Conor Benn to sort of jump on him, sort of around round 7, 8, in those sort of mid rounds, once you realise, well, I've got a skeleton here, a guy that's not really throwing much back at me. But no, Conor Benn, he was very disciplined, just worked from the outside, and was just done his work at sort of range, threw some good combinations, and there was just nothing coming back from Chris Eubank Jr. So he very much just cruised to victory. Um, Chris Eubank Jr., he tried, I think it was in round 8, he tried to sort of come back and he let his hands go a little bit. But again, the punches Chris Eubank Jr. was throwing, there was nothing on them. There was no snap. There was no energy in the shots at all. It was just, pretty much they looked like arm punches, because there was no real energy, no snap, no power in the punches. He was just completely lethargic, and nothing he threw really, bar maybe a couple of shots, bothered Conor Benn. Enough. There was absolutely hardly anything on the shots he was throwing, and it reminded me in some way of several different fights, but in some ways it reminded me a little bit of Oscar De La Hoya's performance when he got stopped by Manny Pacquiao and he thought he could make welterweight, I think it was. He thought he could make the weight, and he just looked like a shell of himself, and he couldn't throw the punches, and Pacquiao was lighting him up. And it was that sort of thing last night where you just saw a fighter that was just, completely shot worn, as some people have said, and it just unable to do anything, unable to really throw punches as he needed to. You could tell that he looked like he was seeing the shots, but he just unable to do it. And for me, I think it comes down to the weight, because when you think about and look at the last fight back in April, even in there, although he managed to win the fight, it was a big struggle, and he had to really grit his teeth and really he had to really sort of put his all into those last couple of rounds to get the victory there. And you could tell that Conor Benn, while losing the fight, he had energy left, whereas Chris Eubank Jr. was just on empty. He was just dry, and he was struggling. And I think, in a sense, you've got to say his dad was right, really, by saying the weights were wrong, because he saw his son struggle the last time, and it turns out, yes, the weights were wrong, and they were wrong for your son, really and truly. So yeah, it's one of those victories where you give credit to Conor Benn. Conor Benn shut Chris Eubank Jr. out. It was a complete shutout. The last round, round 12, he put Chris Eubank Jr. down twice, and to be fair, it was just fortunate for Chris Eubank that he got knocked down towards the end of the last round, because if it was earlier in the round, that second one, then that would have been it. So anyway, let me know your thoughts, and until next time, MK Boxing, over and out.